It is now my pleasure to welcome to the stage Mark Babington. Mark is the Executive Director at the FRC, that's the Financial Reporting Council. Please, Mark, if you can stagger up those stairs. Welcome.
Thank you. Morning.
So Mark is the Executive Director of Regulatory Standards at the Financial Reporting Council. This is the standard setter and audit regulator in the UK, and amongst other things, Mark is responsible for the Corporate Governance Code in the UK. Those of you that have been keeping your eye on the UK press will know that you have a lot to do today as a result of some things.
Or a lot not to do.
Or possibly a lot not to do, yeah. So no pressure there. But thank you very much for joining us today. It's very, very kind of you. I wonder whether we could start by just a little bit by way of background. You're not just at the FRC, you're also a board member at the International Ethics Standards Board for accountants, and you have an outlook over both financial and sustainability disclosure in the UK, as well as corporate governance, as we've just discussed. It gives you a rather interesting perspective. So I was wondering whether you can start by giving us a glimpse into your career and how you've arrived where you are, and what you think some of the big picture questions that we all need to be aware of and work to answer with in the next little while are. So no pressure, just one big question.
Well, I suppose the first point is I never thought it would end up here, which is I spent the first 20 years of my career as an auditor, and it made me realise that I couldn't spend another 20 years as an auditor, so I had to go and do something different. And I arrived at the FRC to lead the development of audit policy as the EU reforms were coming in 2016, and then gradually over time my role has expanded to take on its current form, where I'm responsible for technical and public policy across all of the disciplines that we look at. As you say, I also sit on the board that sets the code of ethics for the accountancy profession, and in my spare time I'm an audit committee chair as well of a public body. In terms of those big ticket items, well, as you sort of alluded to, John, the big ticket items of today might not have been the big ticket items of yesterday, but I think there is one thing that I think is a real sort of personal focus, and the experience we went through with the pandemic really embedded this. All we are about, ultimately, is the provision of high-quality information for decision-making. So what we see at the moment is a particular challenge, and it goes to your point about consumption, which is companies are required to provide more and more information. Whether that information is accessible, digestible, usable, whether it forms decision-useful information is a particular challenge. And one of the things that I know many jurisdictions are wrestling with at the moment is, we've seen the publication of the ISSB's first two standards. How on earth do they fold in to an annual report in a way that doesn't make the annual report 800 pages long, and in a way that is ultimately a source of useful information? And I think, one of the other things, and you referred to the announcements yesterday in the UK, possibly because there's a general election coming within a year's time, there's a real focus on cost and burden on business. And of course, digital reporting is an incredibly cost-effective and efficient way of accessing that information, producing that information, allowing people to take it for decision-making purposes, using a consistent, high-quality framework. So I suppose, the two of the things that are front of mind for me today is how do we deal with ever more information and its usability, and also more and more people are demanding access to this information and need to use it. How can they do so in a controlled way? And of course, the backdrop to both of those is that not that long ago, indeed, when I came to the FRC in 2015, most of the audience we would have talked to would have been auditors and accountants. That's not the case. So we're seeing a much more diverse audience now. We've, of course, seen a huge increase in data and technology expertise, but you go into sustainability, and of course the people working in that space in some jurisdictions are accountants and auditors, but in others there are no accountants and auditors in that space. So therefore, the ability to have access to a reporting framework that takes that information, makes it available in that consistent way is a really powerful one.
Very, very good. You touched on sustainability, and obviously on the relatively immediate horizon, I know that probably general elections and other things will enter into this, but the UK's policies have not yet been set in stone in this context, but we do see right around the world this shift for climate and wider sustainability disclosures to become on a mandatory basis governed by securities regulators, shifting away from the voluntary frameworks that we all know quite a lot about now. So digital disclosure, that is inline XBRL, using those official taxonomies that I was referencing earlier, is a core part of those developments. How do you see the role of digital reporting and analysis sort of changing in the light of the sustainability developments? We also talked about narrative yesterday, and I'm sure it's an ongoing question. There's lots of narrative in these disclosures, and people are probably quite rightly saying, well, what are people going to do with that information?
Well, and this is in a sense the real challenge. Like back in March of this year, I was at an ICGN event in Stockholm, and someone who was presenting said, we've done our first sustainability report, it's 130 pages. And I said, I don't really see that as a criteria for success. Because how on earth are you going to use this? And you know, we've seen the benefits that taxonomies and digital tagging have brought in terms of accessibility of financial information. The challenge for the taxonomy developers is going to be, how do you switch that and extend that into information which is largely narrative? But there is one huge prize that taxonomies can deliver. And if there's a thing that we identify as a weakness through our regulatory activity at the moment, it is companies are good at making narrative disclosures about the impact of climate on their business. But they don't then go on to draw the alignment between the narrative disclosure and the financial statements.
Yeah.
And maybe one of the things that taxonomies offer is a way of almost building in some guardrails to make sure that where you are making disclosures which imply significant, impacts as a result of climate on your business, you can also have a way of ensuring that that feeds through to the financials themselves.
Which is obviously also a question for the standard setters as well. I guess as a little bit of an aside, I asked Flo the same question yesterday, whether we might end up with one standards board that covers both sustainability and accounting eventually as that linkage between material sustainability risks and the financial impact ends up in disclosures. Do you think that might be the eventual way that works, or are these always going to be separate things?
Well, it's a bit strange, really, isn't it? Because the thing that underpins all of this is the integrated reporting framework. So can you genuinely have integrated reporting if you have two separate standard setters? Now, you might always talk about connectivity in the alignment and the work between the two of them, and you might need different skills within the context of one board than another, but surely it's possible to do that in the context of a single board. I think the other thing is, and this sort of, pardon it because it's a sort of interest of mine, and that is that one of the challenges for standard setters is that there sometimes is a gulf between those who write standards and those who use them. And one of the things that we feel a lot at the moment is that, and it's in our public responses to a number of the standard setting boards' own calls for what should they do in their future work plan. And my answer was nothing. sit on your hands, because actually there's enough to digest at the moment. There's huge change coming through. What the market needs is to work out how to digest it, how to embed it. It doesn't need more. So integration has to be the way. And it may take some time to do that, but it's, in a sense, slightly better if it's designed to do that from the outset rather than two separate products are then retrofitted.
Interesting. Food for thought for a number of people here. So pretty much at the same time as all of these changes that we've just described is this question of consumption. I've already jumped on my AI hobby horse this morning in a couple of introductory remarks. But clearly AI is going to impact, well, most parts of life, including corporate analysis. What do you think are the biggest impacts for issuers and regulators, as well as users, who I'm less worried about at one level because I think they're big enough and tough enough to look after themselves. But what are you thinking about in terms of those developments as a regulator?
So I suppose one of the things that is a very live issue is that AI is already being used extensively. The regulatory framework has yet to catch up with that. So if you talk about high quality audited information, in an audit you have to have sufficient appropriate audit evidence. If AI is used to generate that evidence, you may be able to prove it's sufficient, but can you prove it's appropriate? Because every time your AI iterates and continues to learn, do you need to reevaluate? Now, I'm not going to answer that question, but there are some fairly fundamental questions that AI poses for regulators and standard setters about at what point do you find a route to market and a route to a regulated market for the use of AI to produce and develop information, the assurance of that information, the wider sort of context to that landscape. So I think that's particularly important. And you know, one of the things that strikes me, and it's very much there in sustainability as well, which is go back the best part of 30 years when we were looking at the creation of the IASB and the IFRS Foundation, and the world had developed this gap, and the IASB was lowered into it because IFRS was the solution.
Yeah.
Well, we're in a sort of slightly backwards world now where the middle has grown up, but there's nothing around it. And so the question now is, how do you deal with the legislative and the regulatory backfill in a way that builds on what is already there but doesn't require it to be completely re-engineered?
Which is also food for thought for a number of people in this room. Thank you very much for that. I want you now to try to synthesize both those thoughts. So we've already talked about this sort of changing landscape of corporate disclosure, touched on this question of AI, but if you come back, this is all about digital disclosure in this room, to that world, what do you see happening over the medium to long term? And the long term for us these days is 10 years, because you know, who knows what's happening next month. But how's your crystal ball? What does it all look like? Who relies on it? What changes? And don't worry, we won't hold you to it.
Well, if I did know the answer, I probably wouldn't be sitting here. I'd be on a beach still. But it does take you back to that thing of the consumption of information. So if you look from an investor perspective, investors have a critical role in operationalizing the way in which they assess the companies they invest in.
Yep.
So they need to be able to pick a number of data points and need to be able to come to a judgment, particularly where it's not just an index-driven fund, about whether or not to invest and why. And there are ever more of those decisions coming up, and the provision of sustainability information means there are more data points.
Yep.
So you need to be able to take that and to be able to make that workable in the context of the resourcing that is available. And I think the other thing that will become more and more of an issue is at the moment, everything is very much focused on the annual report and the audit of a company and the provision of certain regulatory filings throughout the year. There will inevitably be a demand for more real-time information. So you'll have that challenge of people wanting more immediate access to information, but at the same time, the information that they want access to will, by virtue of what's being reported, be as forward-looking as it is historic. So you have a unique challenge. You are significantly extending the range of data points and the time frame of those data points. And of course, you recognise that the further you go out, the less mature and less reliable they might be. So therefore, the assessment is going to need to be not only do you have all of these things filled, but then which slice can you place most reliance on? Which slice is subject to more judgment? Which slice is, to be honest, this is indicative and nothing else?
Yeah.
I can remember earlier in my career I was responsible for auditing the cost of clearing the Sellafield nuclear site, which runs to tens of billions of pounds. But for the purposes of financial reporting, the only thing you really knew is it's a very big number, and it will move one way or the other. What it said in the accounts was not what it was going to cost. But that's because it was subject to an enormous series of estimates and judgments. But it's being able to communicate that and all of those layers of sensitivity and consideration into a way, again, that responds to your consumption challenge.
So that range of confidence against all of these data points really needs to enter into people's models and thinking, perhaps more than it does today. There's a tendency to go, oh, that's the number.
Yes.
But we live in a world of ifs, buts, and maybes.
Well, look, we've spent years developing financial reporting systems, so they and the controls around them are mature and embedded and, have operated with a long track record. We're now moving that into sustainability reporting where internal controls may be less mature, reporting systems may not even be reporting systems, they may be Excel spreadsheets. And that's all got to move forward to recognise the degree of confidence in that information. And that is going to become much more relevant, particularly to the more sophisticated investor.
And as an aside, we heard from Michael and Florian yesterday about the importance of everybody playing their role and that data quality in the digital context is truly critical, and a lot of that's on the regulators. So can we turn now to the audit profession? The audit profession and audit regulators are very much under the spotlight at present. Providing high-quality independent audit and assurance is a tough exercise. What are the technology developments and policy changes that people should be aware of in this context? What are the big picture things that are impacting that world?
Well, again, I suppose it is the development of technology within the audit context and actually peeling that back to understand to what extent the use of technology is the use of technology and not the application of marketing. And I think that is a very real challenge. I think the other thing is but it is about that information challenge. What you're being asked to give an opinion on is a very different pack to a set of financial statements. Like even in the context of financial statements, go into financial services, the impact of IFRS 9 meant that you bring in a lot more forward-looking information to look at expected credit losses. So, you know, you are asking someone to audit something over which there are far higher levels of estimation uncertainty. So therefore, the work that has to be done to be able to get to a point where you feel that you can give an opinion that says that this is something that, you know, in financial context gives a true and fair view, or the equivalent of that in the context of sustainability, is a real challenge. But the other thing is there are some of these still fundamental questions that have yet to be answered. So the one that I ask almost every time I get together with a group of people like the audience in this room is that, okay, let's jump into sustainability. What does a restatement look like in the context of a sustainability engagement, and is that a good thing or a bad thing? How do I, as a regulator, respond to a sustainability restatement? Because it could be the basis of a mis-selling scandal, or it could be because the development in that sector was so fast-paced, information that previously had not been available was then available.
So the signals that markets need to take from restatements, which are pretty well understood in the financial world, may well be completely different.
Yes, may well be very different.
That's really interesting, isn't it? Good. Food for thought. One more thing on audit then. In Europe, we're beginning to see the impact of independent assurance from company auditors on the inline XBRL as part of the ESEF disclosures. It's still early days. There's quite a bit of work to do in that context and learning for everybody. But that will also be relevant for the EU's CSRD mandate as they go forward with that. The UK, the US and Japan have all stayed quiet on this front for now, which, you know, some of us here find puzzling, given that it's the digital disclosures that our investors are utilising more and more and more, and we very much know that, rather than the printed page. So can you give us any insight into the issues that are being balanced up in this context of deciding whether, and if so, to what extent inline XBRL should be reviewed?
So the honest answer to that would be, in the UK context, that's a matter for government, not for me, which is a helpful thing to stand behind. But in a sense, you sort of answer your own question, which is this the information that is ultimately being used to make capital allocation decisions in financial markets? If it is, then it needs to be as reliable as information that was previously used, be it on a printed page or a PDF or whatever. And therefore, you would want to think that regardless of the form and type of that information, it at least is assured to the same high standard and is as reliable.
That's the answer I was definitely looking for. Thank you, sir. Time for a question or two from the audience, if that's okay, Mark.
Yep.
Who's got a question for Mark? Really? How much did all you guys drink last night? Here's a question.
Mark, we're not going to let you off the hook that easy. That's Lee Watson here. You said government needs to set the standards, so it's not the standards boards to set inline assurance standards. Who should be the standards board for inline assurance if we're truly going to have a global standard that we need for global trusted data? Who should set that standard, and how do we get that adopted in the marketplace?
So, in a sense, the reference to the role of government is that government is the one that has to decide to make the assurance mandatory. Government shouldn't be the one that's setting the standard, because that's not where the expertise lies. Absolutely agree with you that whatever the answer is, it has to be global. Because if this is ultimately driven by costs and benefits to business, there's an international solution that must be able to meet the needs of multiple jurisdictions in a single pass. We have offered on several occasions to draw on our experience in maintaining the UK taxonomy suite to the IASB and the ISSB in support of their taxonomy work. But certainly now is not the time for jurisdictions to go it alone. And indeed, one of the things that takes up a lot of my time and a lot of my focus at the moment is the concern that international sustainability standards are not international, because we are likely, subject to where the SEC gets to in its own rulemaking process, to have US requirements, EU requirements, and requirements that some parts of the rest of the world have. And indeed, the best way it was put to me is, if this was meant to be a global baseline, why did you build it so high? But I do think, you know, from a UK perspective, the UK has benefited enormously from global convergence, and this is exactly the area in which we need global convergence. We shouldn't forget, ultimately, capital is global.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions from the audience? There's one more here. And a microphone is winging its way to you.
Thanks. You were talking about who's creating the taxonomies, and I'm wondering, what's the right balance of, if you will, climate science input into the taxonomies in addition to the traditional financial or accounting input into the taxonomies?
It's a really interesting question, because in the UK, I sit on a number of cross-government panels that look at different aspects of sustainability reporting. And you sit in some of these meetings and people will go, we need to do this about nature, we need to do this about biodiversity, we need this expertise to do this, we need this to deal with transition planning, we need this for net zero, we need this to work out whether or not net zero is achievable. No one else, it sometimes feels, is sitting there in the room to say, actually, guys, how does this all come together? You know, how do you turn this, again, into that package of decision useful information? Because you run the risk that at the moment you won't. So I might be leaning towards the sort of barbarian at the gate sort of end of things, where I would say you need the technical expertise to be able to make it work, but you need to not drown it with so much detail that ultimately what you have is not operable for that decision useful information challenge.
Thank you very much, Mark. I think we need to move on. I was about to say there's going to be time in the break, but I suspect you have to rush away to go and solve a small corporate governance crisis that's being imposed on you. We really appreciate you coming. We didn't know that the government was going to change its mind on important stuff at the very last minute.
Governments always change their
minds. They do always change their minds. But thank you so much for your time and your insights. We really appreciate. Please join me in thanking Mark for his time and his insights.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have a small gift for you. If you're going to come to Switzerland. Thanks a lot.